Great. Thank you so much, Raphael and Sean also, and Eva for the invitation to come and speak here. It's really great to be here. I wanted to start off this talk about representation for animals and speaking for animals with just a sort of a parenthesis about what I'm not going to talk about. So I'm not going to be dealing with the topic of standing, just because it is so technical and country specific. So I thought I might kind of leave that to the side. I'm from Canada, as Raphael mentioned, and standing there is a lot less technical than it is in the US, where animal lawyers have been dealing with these challenges for quite a long time. And there's a constitutional dimension to the problem that we don't really have in Canada. So in Canada, it's like a little bit less of a block, but I think probably the problem is going to look quite different in all different countries. So I will leave that to one side. Rather than focusing on standing, then I'd like to step us back to the more general issue of what was called in an excellent 1991 article by a philosopher named Linda Alcoff, the problem of speaking for others. Alcoff describes our inherent inability to stand in the shoes and speak for others as a crisis of representation. And she points to its many perils. So if you're going to speak for someone else that's not yourself, there's always a possibility of unintended, misguided translation, potentially reinforcing a pattern of dominance. But yet, as Alcoff argues, it is often a kind of necessary evil, really, given the alternative. And she terms that alternative radical retreat. If you think, well, I can't speak for anyone else but myself, and you just decide, well, I'm going to retreat and not say anything, she says that this is really a form of narcissism that undercuts the possibility of political action, effective political action. If I think I can only speak for myself, I won't say anything possibly then at all. And we've also got a problem of solipsism, which doesn't acknowledge itself how doing or saying anything, including doing or saying nothing, is going to impact the social fabric in which each of us is imbricated. So absolute retreat, she says, is an illusion. The question then shifts to how we might lessen the dangers of speaking for others, and especially for others who are less powerful and who are vulnerable, specifically non-human animals, as we are all here this weekend to talk about. So in the talk, I will take up three ways in which non-human animals are being represented or spoken for, and explore Alcoff's idea that what is perhaps needed is less than a speaking for than a speaking with. And this idea that dialogue is potentially a good sort of a goal. So she writes, quote, often the possibility of dialogue is left unexplored or is inadequately pursued by more privileged persons. So we sort of assume, oh, we have to speak for someone rather than actually trying to speak with them or speak to them. Elise Bertenthal, in a piece recommended to me recently by our keynote speaker, Manisha Dekka, thank you much. She has recently written, Bertenthal, that a dialogue can and should come from a place of love. And in that way, technical standing can be around of this standing for, that is really a kind of standing up for, as Bertenthal puts it, standing up for trees, and the possibilities of multi-species communication or interspecies communication. Animals are not voiceless then, even if they're not engaging in articulate speech, as this literature sometimes puts it. Although I think we do often say animals are voiceless and advocates are the voices for the animals, but it's maybe not meant as literally as probably we should be understanding that. Okay, so what's out there? Well, here's the first example I thought I would share with you, especially because in a European context, you might not have heard of this because it's a US phenomenon. There are these programs called courtroom animal advocacy programs, and the acronym for them is CAAPS. And these CAPS programs are operating in some states like Connecticut, where law students are permitted to come into the courtroom separately from the prosecution and represent the animal victim. Okay, now I think the jury is out on these programs and what's happening here, whether it's good or bad, or, and so on, and Brooks is doing some research on this. But I think we can say at the very least that we've got the potential of a problematic doubling down on an accused person who is already at a very serious disadvantage in a criminal justice system, especially one like the U.S. And we could very intelligently ask whether it might be better for veterinarians or someone else who could speak out about the animal's perspective, who isn't already on the prosecutor's side in this very adversarial structure. But I really don't know a whole lot about these programs, to be honest. But if you want to know more, there are folks here at the conference I can direct you to, including Justin Marceau and Kristen Stelt, who could probably tell you more details. But I want to mention it to you just so you're sort of aware of this possibility that's out there. Okay, then the second example I wanted to give was this idea of animal representatives. And here, these are individuals or organizations who can be legislatively empowered to represent an animal or a group of animals. So in Canada, I wanted to share with you, we have this example of the proposed Jane Goodall Act. It's called Bill S-241. And this seeks to offer protections to over 800 species of captive wild animals, including great apes and elephants. And it includes the court's ability to make any order in the best interests of the animal. So that's one of the proposed provisions, including relocating the animal, which is very interesting and could kind of be another way at getting at what Steve Wise and the non-human rights projects are trying to do with their habeas corpus cases through the common law. But here we're talking about legislative approach. And then there's a proposed section in here in making a determination to ask for the expert evidence to be given by an animal advocate. Okay, and this is this idea, animal advocate, that could be pretty cool. And so who would these people be? So the statute sets out that animal advocates would come from one of three places. They could be nominated by the welfare authority of the province. Okay, so in Canada we have provinces, and each province has a body or an agency like an SPCA who could be nominating that person. They could be a representative of a non-governmental organization whose objects include the promotion of animal welfare. So that could be a group like Animal Justice in Canada, who's doing such wonderful work in Canada. Some of you might know of that group. Or it could be a professional in animal science, veterinary medicine, or animal care. Okay, so those are the options that are on the table, and that's quite interesting, I think, and shows the range of possibilities here. Now, unfortunately, Bill S-241 is operating at what we keep calling in the digest a snail's pace. It's really going super slowly, and I don't know if it's ever going to, really come in. But part of the reason I thought it would be good to bring it to this audience is, like let's say it doesn't end up working in Canada, and that's definitely possible. Maybe something similar and equivalent could be started in your jurisdiction where you are. So that I think is worth mentioning. Okay, then in terms of, and I should just say, if anyone is interested in the Canadian Animal Law Conference, it's held together with the North American Animal Law Conference in Toronto at the end of September. There's actually going to be two people, Lori Marino, a neurologist, and Marty McKendry, who works in the Senate, has been working on this bill for many years. They're going to be talking about the Jane Goodall Act and these provisions specifically. So just, if there's any crossover and people are coming, definitely look out for that talk. Okay, now the third way I want to, the third form of representation I want to talk about, is really the sort of status quo situation, which, like it or not, is really a situation where the industry is representing the animals. Okay, and using David Wolfson and Marianne Sullivan's infamous phrase, this is really the foxes in the hen house. And you might think, well, why would you include that in your survey here? But I think it's important because it's sort of the default, it's the backdrop. So if we do what Linda Alcoff says we shouldn't do, which is engage in radical retreat, that is what the radical retreat will be. It will be the industry representing the animals. In Canada specifically, we have a body called the National Farm Animal Care Council, the NFACC. And what these guys do is formulate codes of practice for the care and handling of farm animals, which, it sounds like it would be good, and a little bit like what Soren was talking about. You can go into the codes and you can find all kinds of very nice things, but really they're not being enforced, and there's no there's no consequence for not living up to those standards. And the other problem is then even those codes are themselves industry written. So there is an animal welfare, representative on their bodies, and people can get on there, and try to sort of influence them. But it's very industry dominated. Okay, these representatives and their industries claim to know animals, but really we can argue that they are conflicted out of acting in their best interests. Why? Because they will act in their own commercial interests, and that's sort of the reality. It's not sadistic intent or anything, or maybe sometimes it is, but generally speaking, it's the commercial interests that are prevailing, and that's what the problem is. As Catherine Gillespie puts it in her great book, which many of you may be familiar with, The Cow with Ear Tag number 1389, this is a quote: "Farmers and industry workers know the animals they work with in a particular kind of way. They know them within the confines of their conceptualization as commodities." So, they know, does a cow need a vaccine? Can she give birth again? What kind of milk will she produce? But these are ways of knowing that situate the cow's singularity in the logic of commodification and obscure the fundamental impacts of this logic on her life and her being. Importantly, these are ways of knowing that depend on not knowing other things that will complicate the farmer's role in the process of turning the cow into a marketable good. So not knowing, for instance, her grief at being separated from her babies. Okay, so who might be better placed then to know the animals? And here really some of these recommendations are, in the back of my mind, this idea that, well, if we were to have an animal advocacy agency like Animal Justice be able to be appointed, they're very busy folks, and they're fundraising and they're challenging cases and proposing legislation. So who might those organizations turn to? Okay, and the suggestion here is, well, we could look at some of the sanctuary literature and think about those folks who are working in that space. These are people who know animals in a whole other way, and given the kind of work they do, they're habituated to and trained to give non-human animals that they care for as much autonomy and choice as possible. So Vine Sanctuary co-founder Miriam Jones calls this allowing the animals to be as free as possible. Okay, and again, it sort of lines up with that non-human rights idea that if you're going to be moving or relocating, well, you're not going to be necessarily moving or relocating to an absolutely free condition, but one that is better and as good as possible, so as free as possible. Gentle Barn co-founder Ellie Lax writes in her book, My Gentle Barn, about training children to listen to an animal's body language. And here I brought along My Gentle Barn to show you. There's some folks here who were recently on a Brooks expedition. We went to a Gentle Barn in Nashville. It's really great. That's where I got the book. Again, Manisha, thank you, because Manisha was the one who told me to pick it up. So that was great, and it's really helpful for this. Lax writes in here, when a sheep or chicken walks away, he's saying no. Okay, and that's the way of listening and talking with, perhaps rather than talking to the dialogical idea. For Lax, this is really a focus on the healing effect of the animals, and her central point is that those who have survived abuse and neglect, herself and also the at-risk children that she has come to her sanctuary, they have the right kind of empathy for animals who have also survived abuse and neglect. And some of you might also be familiar with Aisha Akhtar, who is a scientist in the U.S. She has a similar idea in her book, talking about past sexual abuse and the role that animals play in that healing process. And I think here this insight that we can gain from the sanctuary literature points to another group who can be turned to, and with the right kind of training and sensitization could also be excellent animal advocates, and that is youth. So young adults can easily relate to confinement and what it means to have little or no say over what is going on in their environment, in their home environment, and that could be as extreme as abuse, verbal or physical, but also neglect, or just challenges like moving schools or moving cities, more countries. They get it, they understand. And here I think often of my 15-year-old, my child's almost 15, and when they were about 11, I didn't have a babysitter one night, so I took them with me to one of our animal talks. And it was, very heady, it was very abstract, very philosophical. And we were talking about love, and, people were saying, oh, when people say they love animals, like, probably doesn't usually mean love, like hunters say they love animals, or, farmers say they love their animals or whatever. And the speaker, Isabel, was there drawing, and he turned to them and said, "What do you think?" And I was like, "Oh," because I thought, "Oh my God, they're not even listening probably." But they just stayed out right out. I love my dog. I love my dog. That's what came out, and it totally summarized, encapsulated what we were talking about, which is, yes, there are these forms of love that purport or claim to be love that aren't, but there also is this authentic and genuine way of being oriented toward an animal. And in any event, I think there's something there in terms of youth and how they could be used. And obviously it's hard to figure out practically how you would do this, but I think even for adults who are going to be the people who could be called in to be representatives or specialists, you can have them be folks who are using a little bit of this mindfulness idea of beginner's mind, which some of you might be familiar with, this idea that you try to come to something as if you're seeing it for the first time. And that could be sort of helpful here in terms of orientation. And mindfulness meditation is often being used now for animal advocates, to help deal with traumas and other things that they are experiencing a lot of the time. Okay, so some of those adults, who could they be? Well, people who are already in professional roles in which they are recognized as experts. So for instance, veterinarians, behavior scientists, teachers, judges. I think we're so lucky this weekend that we're going to be able to speak with and meet some judges who are obviously already oriented in that way, which is wonderful. Could people who are in these roles, these professional roles, be brought to feel that their role was not in tension with doing the right thing for animals, that their role actually was to do that? And this is not to underestimate the enormous structural and institutional pressures that are brought on people who are working in these environments. As lawyers, we know that, but also, if you're sitting on one of these NFACC councils and you're the one animal advocate, it's very difficult to navigate that role. Similarly, in Canada, we have for animals used in research, we have these animal council care committees that operate at universities. It's a similar kind of thing. You've got one person there as the animal welfare representative. It's very, very difficult for that person to have any say over what's going to happen. So this is very hard, especially for junior people, I think, working in scientific fields or in any fields for that matter. But yet there are opportunities for alignment, which could be increased by encouraging people to view their professional role as a more appropriate conduit for sensitive response. So I think, as I kind of get older and more senior, I start to think professionally, it might actually be easier for senior people to do this because they're not sort of subject to the same kinds of pressures that they may have felt they were subject to when they were more junior. And, perhaps if they've been able to shed some old habits or cognitive biases and so on, I think those folks really can be excellent allies. So in conclusion then, I think it's difficult to imagine a formal system of representation for non-human animals that would completely discard the framework of expert. I think, the world we live in and our culture is very much, privileging that. But yet could we still nonetheless gain something by redefining what an expert is, or who the expert is and what they know? So what sanctuary workers know, for instance. Also, who could tap most effectively into that? A youth working with animals or adults with some awareness of animal suffering who are willing to push the envelope in terms of thinking about what might be compatible with their professional role and bringing that to bear, not only in their own work, but how they mentor others in their field. So here, this idea of paying emotional attention to or taking seriously what animals are telling us, as a way of proceeding, it does run the risk of being partial and potentially impulsive in some ways, but if it can be combined with consistent principled extension of sentiment and practice, and this is a political science article that I came upon as I was preparing for this talk, I'd be happy to share with people if they'd be interested in looking at this more. There are some ideas in there about how to do this. Obviously, it would have to be done with an awareness of fallibility, being open to revision. As Burton-Hall puts it, standing down sometimes is the appropriate response, and not being the voice in some circumstances. But a standing up for is possible and very important, and we should really be considering the possibilities of speaking with and thinking about that in imaginative ways. Thank you.